Hello everyone, welcome to EduTricks channel. Today I'm excited to discuss an interesting topic on how to connect to Azure SQL Server from the container application using service principles or managed identities. I have chosen this topic because I spent a lot of time trying to find a solution for establishing a secured connection to Azure SQL from my containers, and I couldn't find any detailed explanation on this topic either on Google or YouTube. So that was the reason I've chosen this topic. Hope this will be helpful for somebody. So without wasting any time, let's get on to the topic. This slide explains my environment. Basically, I'm running a container application on AKS cluster. If you see here, this is my cluster, this is my container, and I have a DSN created using a driver called data direct driver. I also create a secret which will contain the user ID and the password, basically the credentials to connect to the Azure SQL Server. I've mentioned how my Azure SQL Server was exposed here. I have clearly mentioned it is exposed on a private endpoint, which means the connections are not allowed from public network. When it is exposed on a private endpoint, it will have an IP address associated to it and also a fully qualified domain name assigned to that SQL Server. So you can find these details by logging into the Azure portal. Go to your SQL Server, and then under the network section, you will find a tab called private, and you can find the details of your domain name and IP address in that tab. In the next slide, I have mentioned a few commands that you have to write on your Docker file before you deploy or while you're preparing your Docker file about your driver that you're going to use and the installation directory of the driver and the path to the driver. You need to also configure your ODBC DSN is nothing but data source name. So you need to create a file called odbc.ini and place it in your container, some path in your application container. So that odbc.ini file will have multiple entries, but here I have just explained only a few entries about my driver, what driver it is, and also the domain name of the SQL server and also the database name. But in the later slide, I will clearly explain what exactly you have to put in your odbc.ini file. In this slide, I have mentioned the different available authentication methods on the progress documentation. If you use data direct driver, the documentation says you can use either of these options to connect to the database. I will also show you the progress documentation where it clearly explains these are the available options based on your environment, operating system, database server, etc. You can go through this page offline if you want to know more details about it. In this video, I'm going to talk about two authentication methods basically. I mean, widely used authentication methods. One is SQL Server authentication. SQL Server authentication method is nothing but the user IDs and the passwords are created on the local SQL server by your DBA or somebody who maintains the database and will be shared with you. I have mentioned it's not a best practice due to many reasons that it is not secure. There is no password policy applied. There won't be any auditing or limited auditing on the password maintenance, etc. So that was the reason most of the organization says it is not a best practice. So recently, our organization also has imposed a policy by the IT security team saying you cannot use it, go for another approach with the best practice. So that was the reason I looked at this option. on how to connect to the Azure SQL Server using a service principal or managed identity. If you want to use service principals, use option 36 for authentication method. If you want to go with managed identity, use option 37 for authentication method. This is the important thing. In the next slide, as I said, I have clearly mentioned all the entries that are required in the odbc.ini file. There are two sections in this file. One is ODBC section, first one. In that ODBC section, you have to mention the installation directory of your driver. The other three entries are not that useful, but the next section is about your DSN. So this is the name of my DSN, under which I have mentioned the different entries like driver, where my application find the driver, and the description of the driver, it is data direct driver, as I mentioned. The database name, my application tries to connect, it is something like common database. The host name, this is nothing but the domain name that we discussed in the first slide. The authentication method is 36 because I am going to use service principals as I mentioned in the previous slide. The port number of the SQL Server 1433. See, this port must be open on the network from your container environment to the SQL Server environment. If your domain has applied any certificates also, you need to mention validate certificate 1. If you want to ignore the validation of the certificate, you can go for the value 0. Encryption method 6, the crypto protocol version TLS 1.2 or 1.3. As I mentioned, if there is a certificate on the database, you need to extract that certificate and create a trust store file with some extension, whether it is JKS or some other extension, and put that file certificate in some directory and mention the directory in this property. And if you apply any password to the trust store file, mention the password also in this property. Then host name in certificate is usually the Azure, Microsoft Azure SQL Server's host name ends with database.windows.net. That's the reason I have mentioned star.database.windows.net. So these are the exact entries that we need to mention in the odbc.ini file in order to establish a connection. There is another file that you can also create, which is called odbc inst file, where you can enable your trace, an entry called trace, whether it is 0 or 1, and the path of the trace file. I have not mentioned it here, but that's not a big deal. In this slide, I have explained how to create a secret to read the SQL login user ID and password. This must be also part of your container before you deploy, so that the secret will get created on AKS or whatever your Kubernetes environment is. Kind secret namespace, the namespace of your secret and your application is going to run. The name of the secret is SQL Server SA. Release package tag, if you are following any release package tag, mention the tag here. Under the data, there are two entries. One is for user ID and the other is for the password. These will be encoded base64 encoded format. So in the user ID field, you need to mention the service principal ID. In the password field, you have to mention the service principal password. I mean, this secret creation applies regardless of what authentication you're going to use. So every authentication will have a user ID and password. So you can mention the user ID and password over here. Once you're ready with that, there is a small command based on your application that you're going to deploy, where you can mention your data source name and the user ID and the password. So this user ID and password parameters will read the values from the secret that we have created in the previous section. So this application I'm going to deploy is an integration application using IBM App Connect. So that application accepts this command, okay, where I can mention the data source name and the user ID and passwords. But if you are deploying another application, you need to mention the command related to your application technology. Once you're ready with the application, deploy the container. And after the successful container deployment, you can test based on some commands before executing a transaction or submitting a transaction. There will be a command to check whether the connection is working fine or not. So in my application, I can execute a command like this by mentioning the data source that I have used in my command here. Okay. So if this is the test command. If I run this command, it will clearly show me that the connection is successful or not. So in the output, it is saying me the user, okay, the user is usually this user I have used, is trying to use this data source name, okay, and the connection is success connected to data source this one, using this one, the user to this Microsoft SQL Server. It says the connection is successful. So this is how you can test, but you can deploy and submit a transaction also, which will talk to the database so that you can understand whether the connection is successful or not. So if you follow exactly these steps, you will definitely get succeeded in establishing this integration between your container and your Azure SQL Server. Hope this is useful for you in your day-to-day activities. And if you have any questions or feedback or comments, please write a comment in the comment box. I will try to answer those questions. Thank you for watching.
If you like the session, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.